Hello everyone, it is Joe here from Omnipoke, the channel that brings you guys everything Pokemon. If you're looking for PTCGO codes, including the stuff from Astral Radiance, make sure you go ahead and check out the Potown store. You can get a 5% discount on your order using that code Omnipoke. For today's video, we are going to be talking about how Arceus can adapt in the Astral Radiance format. It seems like everyone has been excited to test out the new shiny toys in the most recent events we've been looking at, and Arceus hasn't been performing quite as well. There's the new introductions, tons of V-Stars to be looking at and to be distracted by, which potentially is why Arceus isn't performing quite so well. It's because people have seen what they can do with Arceus in tons of different iterations and know that it's solid and strong. They want to try out the new stuff. But today we're going to look at how Arceus can react to the most scary cards coming out from Astral Radiance to remain a top contender. Because if there's one thing we saw from Brilliant Stars, it's that Arceus can adapt and survive and has such a strong core at its disposal. With that Starbirth and Trinity Nova combo, you can power up all sorts of supplementary attackers, and you have incredible turn 2 potential when you are the player going first, making Arceus consistently one of the strongest performers due to that just engine that you have at your disposal. You've sometimes got Inteleon, sometimes Bibarel, sometimes just Starbirth and Crobat alone are good enough. So we know the shell is going to be strong, consistent, and will have a ton of energy acceleration at its disposal. So how can we make this as powerful as possible in the new format? Let's have a look at the successful Arceus decks, of which there were many pre-Astral Radiance. So I've sort of split this up in a couple of ways. We have Inteleon builds of Arceus, where we had sort of a pure water approach that had Melanie for acceleration, also offered a water energy attacker in a one prizer from Inteleon, which was very cool, gave you an Aqua Bullet attacking option and quick shooting at its disposal, which was helpful for some math fixing, often gave you a lot of space for the likes of Sharon's Care to try and bounce and have tanky Arceus. Then we saw a similar build also switching to Darkness Energies and adding in a Galarian Moltres as a late game one prize attacking option, sort of starting out the gates with your Starbirth, getting into the game, but then converting in the later stages to Moltres and having Clara to recycle your Moltres. Inteleon Bees as well, another option with Grass Energy, having that Mustard being able to one-hit KO Mews that were often very special energy centric, as well as in mirror matches, if you're going second against an Arceus, you can respond with a Beedrill, because oftentimes there was a double turbo attached to their first Arceus to get things going. And then there was also sort of bird box style approaches with Galarian Zapdos and Moltres all in one deck, sometimes even other tech attacking type coverage mons to one-hit KO respond on whatever your opponent had to throw at you. And sometimes the Arceus didn't even come out to play in certain matchups. It was a much thinner line typically. Really just for situations when you get to go first, you can get that turn 2 Starbirth. But in other instances, you will sort of look to be the majority of the time a one prize attacking deck if possible. So that was more of a sort of tech toolbox, but Arceus was still at the helm because you have that Starbirth, which is just insane at the end of the day. Then there was Bibarel engines of Arceus. Usually this just took up a lot less space than the Inteleon build, which is, you know, a stage 2 line and often required tons of scoop up nets to make full use out of, whereas the Bibarel only takes up, you know, a 2-2 line a lot of the time, 3-2 at the highest end, and you naturally had space for 4 Quick Ball, 4 Ultra Ball, obviously helps you with Industrious Incisors, but also just means you have extra outs to get that early Arceus energy drop down, which a lot of people yearn for, especially in the Inteleon builds, which have less turn 1 push potential. The Bibarel build oftentimes came with a Crobat or 2. Some people even lean towards a Crobat VMAX in their list to give yourself extra draw in those opening stages to make sure you got Arceus attachment to really capitalize when you were the player going first. We had some disruptive builds with Arceus Malamar, Arceus Gengar as well, of course. Corviknight, another attacking option, Lucario V-Star, Urshifu VMAX, Charizard VMAX, Ice Rider, basically binder drop Arceus with Bibarel on top. And this sort of adapted as the format progressed. Early on, there was lots of dark builds because you wanted to have instant responses to Mew. Then it seemed that Crobat VMAX seemed to be enough alongside Path to the Peak, and Crobat just being a great consistency card in general seemed to be people's preferred option, and people would branch off to have fighting type coverage for Arceus Mirrors, have Corviknight as just a big threat that basically had no weakness at the time because fire wasn't really a factor. Then we saw some Charizard actually sweeping in, just because it had such high base damage output in the first place, and Ice Rider as well being a decent card when the scales tipped towards mostly an Arceus meta being the most popular archetype. Ice Rider was almost an Arceus mirror counter, if you will, so that's another one that was relatively successful pre-Astral. Then there were some Jolteon builds as well. They got to a tipping point of everyone using the Inteleon build, so having Thunderous Awakening to shut off water Pokemon's abilities was essentially, again, Garbodor. A couple stages in the format, you were really shutting off the majority of engines. Again, Bibarel's sort of been a late comer to the Astral meta. It was majority Inteleon early on, and we have had to convert to Bibarel, partly because of this Jolteon package, but also just for space reasons. But yeah, this Jolteon came in. We saw a really interesting build with Cincino and lots of sort of controlling cards over in Germany with Philipp Schultz. We saw a Gyarados build as well in Lille, which is very interesting, and even some Jolteon Malamar, I think, brought to the forefront by Grant Manley. So yeah, a couple different ways you can build the Malamar, sometimes with the Jolteon, sometimes just Bibarel hammers. Both seemed relatively strong. And then at the very bottom, we have the Arceus Duraludon deck. This really was early on in Brilliant Stars meta, one of the top performers, and sort of just remained a factor in the format. Never really was the strongest Arceus build, but just sort of did what it did. It was tanky, it was annoying, especially for like sort of toolbox decks that didn't have inherently high damage output at its disposal. Decks that were getting cute and not having enough answers to Skyscraper as well. Sometimes Duraludon simply would punish, and did get its fair amount of top 8 placements as well, so seemed to be one to bear in mind. Now let's talk about the new inclusions from Astral Radiance that I think pose a real challenge to Arceus, and I think the big one is going to be Origin Form Palkia V-Star. This card is just very strong, is coming in to the format at least at tier 1, could even be pushing that S tier alongside Mew and Arceus. I think those are, in most people's eyes, the top 3 threats in the game. I think there's no doubt about that. And Palkia really attacks you on a number of fronts. I think that's the real thing to bear in mind as the Arceus player. Subspace Swell naturally is trying to keep decks at a low bench whenever possible and stopping Arceus going wide, especially with the likes of the Inteleon engine, even with like Crobat Bibarel, something else to attach to with your Trinity Nova. These are all things that Palkia wants to deny or punish. If you do go wide on the bench, they can have very dangerous damage output, which I think is important. Radiant Greninja, just having that Shuriken option, is also very good at denying engine Pokemon in the early stages. Really makes Arceus have a very good opening turn, even without the help of Starbirth. You know, before you have that online, make you try and get things like that Manaphy worked into the equation as well, and ruining some of your early ball search and making you play slightly differently. And also putting more benched Pokemon into play to, again, help the subspace swell. So it's a really vicious combo where Palkia is making you stay small on the bench and Greninja makes you put down a Manaphy, because otherwise they can punish you with snipe coverage and deal with your Sobbles or your Bidoofs in the opening stages and really limits your engine. And then, of course, there's the Starmie V that can punish big Trinity Novas by coming in and swinging for 300 damage. If you've got 3 energy on your active Arceus and you've powered up 3 to a benched one, Starmie just comes in and takes those prizes straight away. So it has an instant response option, even if you get the amazing turn 2 pressure of, for example, Boss Zigzagoon Belt knockout a Palkia. You can just instantly get hit by Melanie attached Starmie return KO. Yes, you can come in and hit the Starmie again, but then it means the Palkia player is the one in control of Roxanne, which is also just below, which is going to be a disruptive supporter, certainly, and is a little bit annoying for Arceus. I think specifically for Inteleon engines of Arceus, this is a bit of an issue. Less so the case for Bibarel. You usually should be able to prepare for it quite well. But it's definitely something to bear in mind if you are going to be the aggressor as Arceus. Know that you can get hit by this Roxanne now, and it can be a comeback card for certain archetypes. So that's why I have this supported down here. It means that you have to be a little bit more aware of where your prizes come from. So something to bear in mind. Then a few annoyances on the left-hand side. Miltank is that annoying ability that can't be hit by V Pokemon. Now again, right now there are many Arceus builds that can't really translate one-to-one over into the Astral Radiance meta, simply because Miltank exists, and this Miltank Blissey deck that's been going around, as well as control builds using Miltank, or even hit-and-run builds using Miltank, can sometimes stonewall some of the lists that we have. We end up just having to poison stuff with Crobat, and that never feels too great. So this new Miltank introduction might force Arceus to adapt its list a little bit here and there to have answers to Miltank. It could be things like cancelling Cologne, it could be some attacking mons that we'll talk about later. So again, something that you just have to think about a little bit differently with Astral Radiance. Temple of Sinnoh as well, I think naturally Arceus is playing high stadium counts, so this isn't a huge issue, but forcing that issue, especially again, Sinnoh combined with a Roxanne, combined with Marnies and whatnot, this is where the stadium gets more dangerous, where the Arceus just has to have the answer in hand at times. Again, Temple of Sinnoh with Hammer Disruption. This can all be very scary stuff, so things that you just have to bear in mind from Astral Radiance now, that some people will be attacking you in these sorts of ways. And just a quick note on Silene, specifically in Mew, I think you might be losing a couple percentage points that you used to have on Mew, because a lot of the time you were hoping it was just too resource intensive for the Mew player to get through, you know, like a big Charmed Arceus, then another benched Arceus, then even Echoing Horn not having enough damage mods at the end of the day. Silene means that they can sometimes discard a little bit more aggressively and push deeper into their deck in the opening stages, knowing that they have Cycle. Or it can mean, if you're in the very late game, they can Echoing Horn maybe twice a game, even with only one copy available to them. So they can really deal with Arceus boards a lot more and have a lot more staying power now that Silene is a card. And I think even just one heads on Silene can turn the tables on an Arceus versus Mew matchup. So I do think you're slightly losing some percentages that you used to have in that matchup. So again, it's one that you do have to bear in mind going into the future. Let's talk about a couple of trends I'm expecting with Arceus. I broke down a number of the builds that we've just seen, and I think I've split it into ones that I think will be increasing in popularity or taking up the share of the Arceus builds versus ones which will be decreasing. Let's start with the increases. So I believe Thunderous Awakening from Jolteon is still going to be strong, although there could be a lot of Arceus builds moving away from Inteleon. That Inteleon share might be taking up now via Palkia, and you also shut down Palkia's V-Star power, which is also a big reason why the archetype is so powerful. Jolteon is relatively solid, but many Palkia decks do choose to run Irida, and that can give them access to Tool Scrapper anyway. So I do think Jolteon is reasonable, but not the sort of be-all and end-all against Palkia. It's annoying, it makes them change their game plan, but you may need to have a higher capsule count if you really want to be very irritating for those Palkia players. I think Barrel naturally is going to be one many people look towards because it gives you natural protection against Roxanne, so I'd expect that to be improving. Ice Rider as well, I think, is a stronger card post Astral Radiance. There's more V-Stars where you can hit that critical 280 number with a belted Max Lance. Rider the High King is still relatively solid, and you even have Horlucha now if you really want to push on V-Max Pokemon, which I also think has its merits. And of course, you get to continue to use the Melanie, which is already great synergy alongside the Arceus. So I believe Ice Rider Arceus could be remaining a presence in the format, which I think is very cool. And then there's the dark stuff, which I still think is relevant. Gengar and Malamar specifically, I think, can really improve by having a couple Dark Patch added into the deck list. It means you're not all in on hitting Trinity Charge or Trinity Nova in those opening stages. These are just useful mons in their own right, which means that even if an Arceus is knocked out early, you still have bounce pack potential, which I think was something lacking with these sorts of builds previously. Malamar is very, very disruptive in general, and we've already seen it can work well with Hammers or with Jolteon, and I do believe there will be a space for the Malamar, especially with Roxanne as an even more aggressive hand-attacking combo to really brick an opponent. I do think that's strong. Gengar, similar to the Ice Rider, where I think that swallow-up, especially with Belt, is a very dangerous number to be hitting, and Fear and Panic is naturally still a good answer to Mew, which seems to still be a very strong threat in the game. Crobat, just because mostly the Crobat V is just so good for consistency, I think the Crobat VMAX will remain for that reason. Some of the ones I think will be less popular going ahead. Charizard, now it's weak to water, now it's not a tank at all. It's going to be basically non-existent, I don't think. Beedrill, its stock goes down a little bit. If Arceus and Mew still remain as popular as they have been in the Brilliant Stars format, and Palkia just takes up the meta share of like those other decks that we were trying, Beedrill is still probably fine because it's good into Mew, still it's good into Arceus, but it is useless basically against the Palkia. You can Jet Spear maybe some one-prize Pokemon, but that's just about it. Otherwise, it's pretty pants. You're really hoping, for Beedrill's sake, that there's things like Samurott and Darkrai having a presence in the meta where you can actually just belt up and Jet Spear through things via weakness, but that's not really going to be helpful for you. There's no real new decks coming out that use special energy, so Beedrill gets a little bit worse. Gyarados has a lightning weakness, which right now sounds fantastic, but post-Astral, a lot of people are looking to counter Palkia, and Gyarados gets caught in the crossfire. So similar to Charizard, it now has a much more relevant weakness in the game, where people are using glasses and Zeraoras, or belting up their Raikus, that sort of thing, and Gyarados really does get hit hard by those things, and you can't really afford to have that on a 3-prize Pokemon. So yeah, the Gyarados is going to be a lot less strong. Urshifu and Lucario, these are mostly here just for being good counter cards in Arceus Mirror, and again, percentage points of decks are going to be taken up by Palkia, which means there's less Arc Mirror, and you have to respect the Palkia that little bit more, so I think these fighting tech Pokemon are more likely going to be other colours of Pokemon, mostly lightning types, I would imagine. Although Urshifu is still a reasonable card in the format, I do think there's going to be more Manaphy. Again, Palkia using that Radiant Greninja so effectively forces more Manaphy into decks, so Urshifu himself gets caught in that crossfire where everyone's naturally playing the tech card, which really neuters the power of the G-Max Rapid Flow. And Duraludon, I think it's still like reasonable, and it does keep a low bench size against Palkia in particular, but the Skyscraper ability is just walling less and less things. It's just gained nothing from the new set, whereas other cards have just gained so much. There's more consistency now in other engines, and I just feel like it's not really gaining as much as the other archetypes are. It could still be a threat in the game, but I don't really foresee it gaining much from the new set. So when you're not gaining cards, you're losing ground to all these other archetypes that get new toys in the mix. And also Duraludon has to worry about things like Cancel and Clone just being a tech card in decks in general. So I do think its usefulness is going down that little bit. Let's talk about some new toys that Palkia is worried about and can be put into Arceus, because I do think Palkia is going to be a big difference in the format, but also there are a couple cards on this slide that can also tackle cards like Miltank and even the Reggie deck. I think Arceus naturally has a good Reggie matchup, personally, as long as you're playing the Dunsparce, but there are some pieces in here that can give it even more issues. So the Surfing and Flying Pikachus seem like absolute meme cards, but they're actually pretty strong, to be honest. The Flying Pikachu does require lightning energy, but both the VMAX and the V have a natural free retreat, which is already very helpful, especially for cheating some slots in your deck, which I think is very cool. And just means that you need to play one less switch card in general, which is a mini space cheat. Also, you have natural resistance to fighting on the Flying Pikachu, which I think is great. It means that you could even be able to cut Dunsparce now and have a decent time into fighting matchups as long as you get the Flying Pikachu rolling. It has natural synergy with DTE as well, which I think is another great thing. If you just don't get to Trinity Charge or Nova, you could still do a Raihan play and get into a Max Balloon and get hitting, which I think is strong. And yeah, it prevents all damage done by attacks from basic Pokemon. So you naturally wall out the Reggie deck, which I think is hilarious, and you wall out Miltank. No, you're not ballooning to damage the Miltank, but they're not hitting you back at all either. So you sort of stalemate them, and you sort of make sure that you have more cards in deck than your opponent, and you're going to try and make the game go like that, or make them start putting down Blissies and play a different game plan. So yeah, I think the Flying Pikachu obviously hits for weakness on Palkia, has a good natural resistance to cover the weakness of Arceus, and is good into some of these all-basic decks, which I think is kind of cheeky. The Surfing Pikachu has a water attack cost, which is very strong, especially because we know that Melanie is already a reasonable option alongside the Arceus, and we've seen a ton of water-based builds. And it also means you can play some of the other Tech V Pokemon down here, the Empoleon and the Starmie, naturally in your deck, which I think is very cool. The Max Surfer does 160, again enough to knock out Palkia's, and you do a 30 spread as well to your opponent's bench. And if you're going to be playing Inteleon, you can try and do some cheeky, quick-shooting shenanigans and take out some one-prize engine Pokemon as well, which I think is kind of cool. So the Surfing Pikachu as well, a reasonable include, even as a thin line. Tapu Koko VMAX, the regular V from Sword and Shield has free retreat. So again, like the Flying Pikachu, it gives you a natural pivot. And Max Shock alongside Roxanne could offer one of the most disruptive combos in the game, where you paralyze and put your opponent down to a low hand size. Especially because there's really aren't many switch outs in the format right now. You know, Mew is sometimes playing 3 to 4, but they naturally cycle so much in the opening stages, they've probably burned a couple. Arceus is probably playing 1 Sharon's Care and like 1 Balloon, 1 Switch, stuff like that. So you can really punish people, especially by the time you've got to that mid game. They've usually spent some of those resources just throughout. So this Paralyze can be a very strong option. And again, you're hitting for that crucial lightning weakness. If you're going for a slightly softer approach, you can try some Raikou and Vikavolt tactics. I think Vikavolt item lock in general is pretty strong in the meta, and obviously can super zap cannon through some Palkias if need be. And the Raikou again can be a potential Raihan target just to get that Rondo out of nowhere. Could be part of that Inteleon toolbox that I was talking about, where now Lightning becomes a big part of your combo. So just one to bear in mind. And then for more water attackers, Empoleon with that Emperor's Eyes can turn off a Miltank, so you're naturally just swirling through them quite easily, and it really does flip what would otherwise be an awkward matchup. And you also get the small upside of denying Regigigas their ability as well, which I think is kind of funny. And Starmie can be very nice in mirror match situations, as a natural free retreat once again, and its Swift Attack can at least do a little bit of chip damage to the Miltank, although it's going to be difficult to 1v1 them if you have had to go wide on the board early. But hopefully, if you're using a water energy build of Starmie, you could also use the Inteleons and try and attack with those at the same time. So hopefully that gives you enough in those sorts of matchups. So these are some of the cards that I'm expecting to be partnered up with Arceus in the new set. I think Lightning is going to have a big meta share with Arceus. It's a no-brainer really that Arceus is always colorless and you can just fit your playstyle to the most popular decks in the room, and in this case it's going to continue to be dark stuff because of Mew, but also Lightning could be taking that sort of secondary slot in a lot of Arc builds. So let's have a look at a couple sort of speculative builds of Arceus. The first one is going to be a Barrel Bat engine. This obviously has a lot of precedent of doing well in recent Brilliant Stars events, and we've tried to slide in a 2-1 line of the Flying Pikachu VMAX with just 3 Lightning Energy. This really isn't too far away from previous builds of Arc Bib Bats that we've seen in the past. You've got Crobat and Hooper to be pressurizing in the Mew matchup, as well as Hooper helping out against Arceus. You also have the Flying Pikachu now as a secondary attacker against Urshifu as well, because you have that resistance. So yeah, Hooper and Pikachu should give you a good time into the Urshi, especially with the Manaphy, even without the need for Dunsparce, which I think is pretty cool. You've got your Paths as well as Dark Pokemon for the Mew matchup, and yeah, Flying Pika is hopefully going to be a relevant card against the Palkia. You have 310 natural hit points, and you can Big Charm up if you really need to. And yeah, you're naturally covered by Roxanne. We're not playing it ourselves because you can't tutor it out at the right time. I feel like Roxanne's a better card in Inteleon engines. So we're just sticking to the old faithfuls of Research and Marnie. Still have a couple Sharon's Care in here. I do think it's a slightly less strong card in the format, but as long as there's going to be Arceus in mirror match situations, the Sharon is still going to be king, and it feels kind of weird just having a 1 copy when you're using a barrel engine. You want to have the option when needed. So yeah, a pretty interesting mixture of Dark and Lightning type coverage, which I think are the 2 key weaknesses to be hitting in the format, still with that barrel shell that we've seen do so well. Let's have a look at the surfing approach then. This is going to continue to use the Inteleon engine, and I don't think Inteleon's completely going away, by the way. I still think it's relatively strong, and as we know, this has been one of the most successful ways we've seen Arceus throughout Brilliant Stars, so you can't completely write it off, especially because a lot of my decks aren't playing Roxanne. It's only really other Intel decks, which I like Roxanne in, quite frankly, so I'm playing 1 copy in this list. I'm also playing a Roxanne in most of my Palkias, because that's another Intel engine. But it means you're not constantly getting hit by it. And I think the good news about Arceus is that even if you are getting hit with Roxanne, at the very least you have a lot of energy around your board naturally, because you're constantly spamming your Trinity Nova attack. You'll have a backup Mon ready to rumble, which I think is very cool. We've gone for the minimalist Pikachu package here, just a 1-1 line of the Surfer, and we are playing 1 copy of Starmie V. Naturally as well, because you play the Inteleon as the Shady Dealings and the Quick Shooting, you can try and pressurize Miltank with your 1 prize Pokemon, of course, but also the Starmie can come in. I think what's really interesting about the Starmie as well is that as soon as you start going Inteleon, usually the Miltank player starts loading up a Blissey, and that's when you can punish them with the Starmie, which I think is pretty cool. And once you've got that big Blissey knockout, you can be using Swift into a Miltank if really necessary. So I think that's pretty interesting. We are playing the Collapse as a counter stadium. It also causes a headache to Gigas, which I think is a small upside here as well. But again, this is pretty tried and true to a typical Arc Intel, but has a mini Pika package, basically. We are trying to cheat a couple of spaces. Like I said, just 1 Sharon's Care I think is going to be more often than not the right counts in this new Astral format. Still have that Big Charm, still have the Raihan and Melanie combos. I am splitting the Marnies and the Roxanne up. I do feel like it's worth having one of each, but it could end up that just having a second research or second Marnie is going to be preferred. Something I need to test out a little bit more. But yeah, a pretty straightforward Arc Intel with a couple tech cards to deal with the new Pokemon coming out in the Astral meta that really challenge Arceus for the most part. And then one final list is going to be a more disruptive approach with Arc Mally. Arc Mally Hammers actually got second place at the recent special event in Milan. And this is a slightly reduced build with less fans that was played to a second place finish, but it does add in one copy of Roxanne. Roxanne's kind of weird with Arc Mally because typically you go down, well, your opponent goes down to one prize card a lot of the time, and the Roxanne is really just used to get them out of boss's orders to deal with Bibarel or deal with Zigzagoon to close out the game. So it's really just trying to buy you like 1 or 2 key turns, but a lot of the time you're trying to use this as a Hail Mary play, unless the opponent has gone for like knockout Arceus plus knockout Bidoof or Zigzagoon or something like that. And you're doing it alongside the Malamar. That's when it's at its strongest, but sometimes it's just thrown in the later stages once your first VMAX has gone down, so something to bear in mind there. I am upping the boss count to 2 because I feel like it's so important to boss up the barrel engines if you are going to get successful max jammers, and hammers are still strong. Hammer Path is still annoying for Palkia at times, and Hammer is still obviously very good in Arc Mirror Match situations, and can even be helpful at stopping Mew having all the fusion energy on board at once to blow through your entire board. So I do feel like Malamar is hyped up from this set because of the combos with Roxanne. I haven't found the space just yet to play Dark Patch and go for a heavy Mally approach where you sort of try and get that turn 2 max jammer off. I still feel like having Starbirth at your disposal is going to be the best option to get this deck rolling, to make sure you can hit things like Path as early as possible, and get your barrel engine up so that you're also prepared for your opponent to Roxanne you down to low hand sizes. So that's something to bear in mind. But yeah, just a few approaches of Arceus that I've been trying out recently. This one isn't really type coverage based, it's just trying to crumb people over with Max Jammer, which is universally strong. You know, no matter what deck you're coming up against, Max Jammer is going to be annoying alongside Marnie and alongside Roxanne, especially when you're throwing hammers into the mix. This is just sort of the catch-all, at least I'm annoying the opponent and making them brick approach, which I think is very valid still in the format. So my closing thoughts on Arceus then. Naturally, I still think it's going to be one of the top dogs, but there are some things to bear in mind and respect for Arceus going forward. It's not going to be quite a simplistic list that we have previously seen of Arceus, where it was pretty much just like an overstatted card and nothing got even close. Now we have Palkia that has similar stats, and just more V-Stars coming into the mix, which are other Pokemon that Arceus has to settle for 2-shotting most of the time. You can have longer gameplay against them, and they have one-hit KO potential. Things like Darkrai can one-hit KO, things like Samurott can one-hit KO, Palkia can one-hit KO, and these are the things that you do have to be a little bit concerned about. Palkia itself has good going first and second options. If they've gone first against you, you have to be very worried about how wide you go on your board. You may have to forego Crobat and just deal with like having one Arceus active and one Bidoof on board, hoping that you can tank a V-Star turn 2 from them. So these are things that you do have to bear in mind. And if you're the player that has gone first and you are going for attacks with Trinity Nova, definitely think about how many energy you're putting onto the board, because they can easily just swing back with a Starmie. So something that you really do have to consider. Miltank's certainly a card worth respecting. As we've seen in the past, over and over again, these Walling Mons, especially from a basic, where it's such an easy include for certain decks in 1 to 2 counts and just like an ordinary rod, it can be a win condition on its own. So yeah, respect the Miltank, whether it's going to be from cancelling Cologne, whether it's going to be from Empoleon, whether it's going to be playing Inteleon, even going to like double Shady Dealing Inteleon, to be a card that can just attack the Miltank aggressively. Even playing like Tool Scrapper alongside your Inteleons could be very strong to get rid of Cape of Toughness, so they can't just Sharon loop you. These are things that I do think are going to be relevant in the format, and I think Arceus does have to think about these sorts of things. And finally, Roxanne is probably going to be a great card for Arceus, but also changes how some Arceus builds have played. Naturally, people are leaning towards with Barrel, I think, right now, as just an easy, I don't have to worry about Roxanne, I can always top up my hand. But even some Inteleon engines have played a 1-1 Barrel in the past, and I could easily foresee that being the case for Arceus's of the Astral Radiance meta. So that's really all my thoughts on Arceus. Where do you think it places in the format? Is it playing second fiddle to Palkia now, or is it still going to be up there hanging with the best decks and adapting? Let me know your thoughts down below. What's been your favourite way to play Arceus? Has it been one of these new lightning type attacking Pokemon, or is it some of the old faithfuls from before? Let me know down below. Thanks so much for watching, and I will see you in another video tomorrow. Cheers.